Now, if you are unfamiliar with the man sitting next to Champ, he catches rattlesnakes with his bare hands. That's all I have to say. That's all I have to say. And he's also running for president. He's a member of a family that America has loved for so long. Unfortunately, there's been, a lot of controversy around his family, but he's here to tell his story. So, welcome, Robert F. Kennedy. Bare hands. Bare hands. Just.
His phone is about to start.
Oh, man.
Yeah.
Yeah. Put it right there. How you doing, sir?
I'm very good. Thank you. I'm happy to be here. Thank you for having me.
Yes. First question I wanted to ask you. Have you ever been bitten by one of the rattlesnakes that you catch with your bare hand?
I've never been bitten by a poison snake, but I've been bitten by a lot of other snakes.
Oh, wow. So they were like, practice before you got to the rattlesnake. You had to master your technique.
As a politician, that answer could have a bunch of different meanings to it. Been bitten by a bunch of different other guys.
That's how I heard it. Metaphorically, yeah.
That was my first. Is that so?
Wow.
Well, that's so too. I've been bitten by literal snakes too.
Yeah.
I was with my kids in Ecuador one time on a plantation, or a banana plantation, and there were canals in it, and they were taking when they caught the snakes in the canals, they would throw them into a cage, and so there were about 20 or 30 of them in a cage, and I reached in to grab one of them, and a lot of them bit me all at once.
Why?
But when they bite, these are like little anacondas and boa constrictors. When they bite you, they leave their teeth in you. And some of those teeth didn't come out of my hand for over a year.
What?
Wow. Did you know that?
Yeah.
Did you know that the teeth do that when you reach for the snake?
Yeah, I did, but I hadn't had that experience before. I was surprised about how many of them decided to bite me at the same
You're
time.
surprised?
Wow, that's a lot.
They were like, it's a Kennedy, get him! It's crazy. Now, I wanted to, but usually when it's presidential candidates, not many people are versed in who these people are before we see them standing behind a podium telling us things. So I like to start from the beginning. Your childhood, what were your earliest memories like?
So I'm one of 11 kids. I'm the third of 11 kids. My father was Robert Kennedy, who was the Attorney General when I was born. He was an attorney and he was working for my uncle, John Kennedy, who was then a senator.
Right.
And I was born in 1954, and this was, and my uncle ran for president in 1960.
Right.
Oh, and I remember that campaign very well. I went out to Los Angeles for the convention. It was the first time I'd ever stayed up all night.
Mm-hmm. How old were you?
At that time, I was 7.
Wow. Mm.
Oh, and there's pictures of me in the convention with my brother playing with a snake on the table that I had caught.
It's been a lifelong thing right here.
Yeah, big problem.
Right.
So many questions. You just got to leave alone.
So my uncle was Attorney General. My father was president, and that was at a time when their principal preoccupation with the civil rights movement. They were fighting to get James Meredith. They sent 20,000 troops down to get James Meredith into the University of Mississippi. Mm-hmm. They sent troops to Alabama, 16,000 troops to get Veronica Malone. Mm-hmm. And 5 other students into the University of Alabama. They were in a fight with George Wallace, who was a segregationist. He famously vowed segregation now, segregation forever, as his sort of campaign slogan. And he was their nemesis. And they got to play an important role in making this country a true constitutional democracy for the first time in its history. I was saying to somebody the other day, And I was born in Virginia at a time when there was still Jim Crow law, so it was illegal, for example, for a black man to marry a white woman or vice versa.
Right.
And we had a groom, like a handyman who worked for us, who became very close to me because I spent a lot of time out hunting and trapping hawks and other animals. And he would drive me around the state of Virginia. He had been a CB in World War II. Mm-hmm. Blacks weren't allowed to fight. Black men were not allowed to fight in World War II until the very, very end.
Right.
But they served in the military, but they usually served on construction crews. And he had been in a construction crew in the South Pacific. He was about 6'5", extremely intelligent, very articulate, and dignified. But when we drove around Virginia, when we stopped for lunch, I would have to go into the diner and buy food for both of us and then come back and eat it in the car together because of segregation laws.
Right.
He one time asked me to come with him to Solana Village, which is a little shopping area, like a village near where there was a shoe store.
Right.
And because he was not allowed in the shoe store. And I had to go in, give his size to the salesman, and bring out the shoes. And he tried them on the sidewalk. And if they didn't fit, he couldn't bring them back. At that time, it was very common for black people to have corns because of that problem, because once they tried on the shoe, they could not hand it back. So if it was too tight, and you would see at that time a lot of black people that had cut pieces out of their shoes, to alleviate the pain.
Wow.
But, my father, my uncle got to play this very important role with Dr. King, working with him. They organized together with him the Civil Rights March in 1963 when he gave his I Have a Dream speech. My father then, continued to work with Dr. King after my uncle was killed in '63. He had been in a war with his own CIA and with his intelligence apparatus. And he was killed in Dallas, assassinated in Dallas in 1963.
Yeah.
He didn't want to go to the Vietnam War. So he sent his advisors honored him and his intelligence apparatus. He fired the heads of the CIA right as soon as he became president because they tricked him into the Bay of Pigs invasion. Mm-hmm. And he knew that they had lied to him. And he came out of a meeting that night and he said, I want to take the CIA and shatter it into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. And he fired Allen Dulles, Richard Bissell, and Charles Cabal, the three top guys of the CIA. But he was surrounded by an intelligence apparatus and military that wanted to go to war, that considered war with the Soviet Union, at war with Cuba, both inevitable and advisable,
right.
Desirable. And he didn't want to do that. They wanted to send 250,000 troops to Vietnam, and he refused. He sent 16,000 advisors, so he never sent a combat troop abroad. He told his best friend, the primary job of a president of the United States is to keep the country out of war. And he refused to send combat troops to Vietnam. He sent Green Berets to advise the Vietnamese. Some of them did fight, which was against the rules of engagement. A month before he died, he asked for he heard that one of the Green Berets had been killed, and he asked for a casualty report. And his aide brought him the report and showed that 75 Americans had died. And he said, that's too many, I'm pulling them all out. And he signed that day National Security Order 263, ordering all troops home from Vietnam, with the first 1,000 coming home in December. This was October. A month later, he was killed. And a week after that, Lyndon Johnson remanded that order and then ended up within a year sending 250,000 troops over. It then became an American war. Nixon, who came in after him, sent in 560,000, 56,000 never came home, including my cousin George Skakel, who was killed at the Tet Offensive. My father ran against the war in '68, so 5 years later, against Johnson. It forced Johnson out of the race. So he ran against an incumbent president, the same as I'm now doing in the Democratic Party. It forced Johnson out of the race, and then my father was shot. And after winning the California primary, my father was shot in June of 1968, on June 5th, and I was with him when he died. I was 14 years old then, and we flew him back on Vice President Humphrey's plane, and we waked him here in St. Patrick's Cathedral. And I remember coming out, there was crowds that were eight deep on the sidewalk as far down Fifth Avenue and Madison Avenue as you could see. And when we came back out of the church, and I was one of the pallbearers, there was a black lady who was very, very large, and she broke down. She knelt down on the, like fell down on the sidewalk, and she was holding a handkerchief and saying, shouting at my father, "You did your best, you did your best." And it was a very moving moment for me. Then we took him to Penn Station, and we brought him down to Washington, D.C. on the train. That train ride is supposed to take 2.5 hours. It took 7.5 hours because there was 2.5 million people on the tracks. And it was a whole cross-section of the American experience. And I was a 14-year-old boy riding on that train with all the people who would have been part of his government. There was poets, and there was economists, and writers, and priests, and rabbis. But the crowd along the track was a cross-section of the entire American experience. And all the major cities in Trenton, Newark, Baltimore, Wilmington, we crawled through the train stations at maybe 1 mile an hour because there were so many people in the station, all black faces. They were singing the battle hymn of the Republic, Glory, Glory, Hallelujah, which was the same hymn that they had sung when Lincoln had died, and they brought him back to Illinois on the train. And in the countryside, there were whites, and they were people in military uniform. There were Boy Scout troops standing at attention. I remember passing a Little League field where all of the people, the players on both sides, were standing at attention, holding their gloves at their chest, the coaches, all the people in the stands. I remember outside of Wilmington looking down on a field, and there were 6 nuns standing in the back of a yellow pickup truck, and they were all waving their rosaries and handkerchiefs at us as we passed. People were holding signs that said, "Goodbye, Bobby," "Pray for us, Bobby." And they were holding American flags, and there were hippies, there were people in military uniform. It was, and then when we got to Washington, President Johnson met us there, and then drove us in a convoy up past the mall. And at that time on the Washington Mall, there was probably 6 or 7, maybe 8,000 men encamped. My father had been communicating with Dr. King, and at that time the Vietnam War was robbing the poverty program. And Dr. King broke with the rest of the civil rights movement because he said, we need to be opposing the war. That has to be because, and the rest of the, even Walter Fauntleroy and Ralph Abernathy and many of the other leaders of the civil rights movement were telling him that stay in our lane. We need to focus on civil rights. Don't get involved in the war. And he said, if you can't separate them, because that war is robbing the poverty programs at home, but also it's black people are fighting that war. And they are going to, and the violence is going to come home. You cannot be an imperial country abroad and still be a democracy at home. It's going to turn us into a surveillance state, a security state, and the violence is going to come back. And all of the issues, the oppression, the hunger, the violence, the deprivation, it is going to come up. Yeah. So my father and he got together, and they had both worried at that time about how do you get legislation for the poor. And my father had said to Dr. King, the only way to do it is do it the same way we did with the Civil Rights March. Have poor people come to Washington, camp on the mall, and don't leave until there's legislation, taking care of homelessness, etc. So they had both put together this woman called Marion Wright Edelman, who was friends with both of them, and to organize the Poor People's Campaign. Dr. King had been killed 2 months earlier. My father was in Indiana when Dr. King when his death was announced. When my father learned, and my father was in the black sect, was going into the black neighborhood in Indianapolis, and the chief of police said, "You can't go in there. It's going to erupt in violence when they find out." My father went alone because the police wouldn't accompany him. And he gave a speech that's one of his most famous speeches, in which he talked about his own brother being killed by a white man. And that what our nation needs is not hatred and anger and division. What we need is love. And he quoted Aeschylus to a group of Americans, black Americans, a famous poem where Sophocles says that our objective is to tame the savageness of man and make gentle the life of the world. That night, because of his speech, Indiana was the only city that didn't burn in our country.
Wow.
There were riots in every other city. So now 2 months later, my father is killed. And all these poor men are encamped on the mall, and as we drove by them, they all came to the sidewalk, and they stood with their heads bowed and their hats against their chest. And we drove my father up the hill and buried him next to his brother under a small stone at Arlington. And I remember 4 years after that, looking at, I was at college then in Boston, I looked at this demographic data. I was studying politics and American history, and it showed that in 1972, 4 years later, the white people who had lined that track and who had supported my father strongly during the 1968 election, 4 years later, they didn't vote for George McGovern, who was aligned with my father and very close, good friends with him, but instead they voted for George Wallace, who was running that year too, who was antithetical to everything my father believed in. So how did these whites, who were aligned with blacks and this idealistic vision that my father had of this country, suddenly 4 years later, they were angry, bitter, racist, segregationists. And, it occurred to me then, and it struck me many, many times since, that every nation, like every individual, has a darker side and a lighter side. The easiest thing for a politician to do is to appeal to our fear, our greed, our hatred, our anger, or our xenophobia. And that, what my father did was to try to do something different, which is to get us all see each other as part of a community, and to take risks for people who don't look like you, and to feel like we're all part of a noble adventure, to make this this experiment in democracy work for our country and for the rest of the world. And he was able to do that, to get people to find a hero inside of themselves and put aside a lot of their fears about their neighbors and avoid the seduction of the notion that we can advance ourselves as a people by leaving our poor brothers and sisters behind.
It's hot for trapper turn smack rapper. Only smack rapper that you know is smack rappers. Got bars I can hang with the backpackers. Trap star, I don't hang with the backpackers. I'm in the hood with the work you heard. Making fiends leave earth you heard. Got your baby mama thirst you heard. Feel the flow, nigga, throw it in reverse. This the wave you need to surf you heard.